welcome. Are we on with the mic? Yeah, we are. So welcome to this event that is sponsored by the Mennonite Heritage and Agricultural Museum. It's great to see such a crowd today. It's part of the year-long series celebrating the 150th anniversary of the 1874 Mennonite immigration, particularly of the Alexandroville Church from South Russia. I'm Nancy Stuckey, and I've been part of that planning committee that's been working on those plans. I'll do a little commercial for the museum. I'll call attention to the table that's in the back of the sanctuary. There you can sign up for museum memberships or sign up for the Heritage Dinner on April 5. Maylene Vinson will be talking about packing a trunk for the journey. And of course, donations are always welcome back there too for the museum. And Dr. Jantzen will probably have some handouts that he'll refer to later that will also be available there. Last month, we enjoyed hearing Rod Ratzlaff talk about the early Prussian part of the Alexandroville history. And today, we're honored to have Dr. Mark Jantzen here from Bethel College to speak about 53 years in the Russian Empire, the context for Mennonites in the years 1821 to 1874. Mark Jantzen grew up on a dairy farm near Beatrice, Nebraska, and is a graduate of Bethel College. He served with Mennonite Central Committee in East Germany and in Serbia. He has been teaching European and Mennonite history at Bethel College since 2001. Among his books are these three: The Wrong Side of the Wall, An American in East Berlin During the Peaceful Revolution, Mennonite German Soldiers, Nation, Religion, and Family in the Prussian East, 1772 to 1880, and A European Mennonites and the Holocaust, co-edited with John D. Thiessen. He has led student tours to Eastern Europe and leads an annual Mennonite Experience in Poland history tour. After his talk, there will be time for questions. During that time, Chris Schmucker, one of our Alexandroville historians, will also be available to field some Alexandroville-specific questions if needed. Welcome, Dr. Jantzen.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here, and I want to thank Nancy and the committee for inviting me and for getting everything going for this 150th anniversary. Really appreciate the attention to history, of course. And I want to thank Rod for getting it started. And he talked about the cemetery at Pshahufka, for those of you who were there last time. And I just wanted to point out that I'll be leading a tour that's going there in July. So if you want to see those things that he was talking about, there's a prospectus out back that you could look at, or we could talk about that afterwards as well. What I want to talk about now is really the context of the Pshahufka congregation in Russia. And so that's why we're just looking at a certain span of years. Other Mennonites showed up earlier, and some stayed much longer in the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire looms large in Mennonite memory, especially for those of us with Dutch, Polish, Prussian, or Russian background. The books written about this episode in our history could fill an entire section of a library. The University of Toronto Press, one of the most prestigious academic publishers in Canada, has its own book series dedicated just to Tsarist and Soviet Mennonite studies. After the fall of the Soviet Union and before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, thousands of Mennonites in North America with this background made the pilgrimage back to the ancestral villages in Ukraine and cruised the Dnieper River. A wide range of events to commemorate the immigration 150 years ago from there to North America have been planned, including a new documentary up in Manitoba with a budget of tens of thousands of dollars. To mark the distinctive origins of the waves of this migration to Kansas, different Mennonite communities here are doing a range of independent activities instead of one centralized set of events, an approach that mirrors the cohesion of themes and the differences of approaches that marked Mennonite life in the Russian Empire as well. Next year will mark the 500th anniversary of the origins of the Anabaptist movement And the group of Mennonites we are thinking about this afternoon have roots that go back almost that far. So if you look at this slide, you think of every line as representing 50 years, so including the blanks. And that shows if we slide the scale of memory out that far, you'll find that some part of many of our families spent a few dangerous years or decades in the Netherlands or Flanders before moving quickly to the Vistula River for something like 250 years. 200 of those years were under Polish rule, and 50 years or less were under Prussian rule, as Prussia partitioned and took over Poland. And then there were just barely 50 years in the Russian Empire, and now 150 years in the United States. Recalling this longer version of our history might make what we are doing here today seem a bit skewed. Why does only 10% of the timeline, those 50 years in Ukraine, take up such a disproportionate amount of space in our hearts and minds? This question obviously does not lend itself to a single or simple answer. Nonetheless, posing this question highlights the fact that something significant and unusual happened for Mennonites in those 50 years that did not happen in Poland or Prussia or in the United States. I think that a key change was in how the community saw itself, or in other words, how it thought about or experienced its own community identity. 4 factors that changed this important area of self-perception were new limits to community boundaries, which became more restrictive in terms of social relations. We'll get there. There we go. There were expanded theological boundaries as Mennonites associated with outsiders to cooperate on new important Christian tasks. Next, there we go. Education was a new theme which provided new intellectual tools for the task of envisioning and strengthening community identity. And Mennonites became wealthier in the Russian Empire, which bolstered a sense of independence. All of this grew out of the political system the Russian Empire imposed on all of its foreign settlers, including Mennonites. Mennonites entered the Russian Empire as religious and economic refugees or migrants, seeking tolerance that included access to economic opportunities, an aspect of toleration that had been taken away from them in Prussia. Those who arrived 50 years later in the United States had become a Mennonite community that thought of itself beyond congregational boundaries, but as still different from other Christians. They were now a community that learned that they needed to found, create, run new kinds of institutions in order to follow Jesus faithfully. They had switched from being a community built around replication of family and congregation to being a community focused on making things happen out in the world. So to see what changed, we'll spend a little time in Poland, and then we'll see how things move to the Russian Empire. So this is a map of where Mennonites lived in Poland, and you have to imagine the Delta region on the left is at the top, and then the right side of the map should go underneath it. But if we put it all together, you'd all have to turn your head sideways. So just use your imagination. Put the one part of the map on top of the other. And if you look at where you see the little underline in red, that's the village of Szahówka. So that's where this congregation would have been 250 years ago. And Mennonites lived here in this area for 250 years. The last 50 years that they were there before they moved to the Russian Empire, they got a new government because the Prussian kingdom took over Poland. So the last 50 years, they're living under Prussian rule, but they didn't actually move anywhere. They just got a new king. Next, one more. There you go. So where you see the circle number 1, that's the part of Poland that was taken over by the Kingdom of Prussia. So they got a new king. Next one. What were community boundaries like in Poland? Next one. Mennonites in Poland lived in mixed villages with Lutherans, Catholics, once in a while a few Jews, mostly with German speakers. There were some Polish speakers in their villages. Their education was rudimentary for the most part, focused on basic literacy, and often acquired together with non-Mennonites in settings like village schools. Some Mennonites who lived in or close to cities, a small minority, might have gotten some additional education. In this context, all religious formation would have happened in the congregation and in the family. The only institutions that Mennonites ran in Poland were their own congregations, and that included taking care of their own poor. Until 1772, when the Prussians took over, there was no regular contacts between all the Mennonite congregations in Poland, and thus no Mennonite institutions beyond the congregation. Out in the villages, Mennonites were clearly second or third class subjects of the Polish and Prussian crowns. Nonetheless, along the Vistula River, government regulations, custom and survival, next one please, all required that everyone living there cooperate, and another one. Everyone had to cooperate to maintain the dikes and the roads. Thus, Mennonites were integrated into these important social structures along the Vistula, but clearly separate in terms of religion. Politically, Mennonites had well-honed systems of negotiation with political overlords for religious tolerance that typically involved making payments to the government. Next slide, please. In addition, they sought and obtained charters of privileges from Polish and Prussian kings. These charters enumerated and listed their religious freedom under separate laws that only applied to Mennonites. Before 1772, Mennonites would have mostly, but not exclusively, married only other Mennonites, and such converts as there might have been had come mostly from among their hired help. After 1789, both mixed marriages and any type of conversion from outside became incompatible with keeping their status as religiously tolerated individuals. It was illegal for them to do these things. And this was an important shift that shut down some important social relationships just as Mennonites began moving to the Russian Empire. So this is a broad overview now of where Mennonites settled in the Russian Empire, and you can see the dots that represent lots of different colonies. The one we're talking about is circled in red, Molochna, and to the northwest of that there's another one, Kortica, that we'll be talking about. And so this now takes us to Molochna colony, and you can see lots of the villages, and along the left side of the screen there's a line of villages across a river that's a slightly different shade. Those would be German settlers who are Catholics or Lutherans. But most of these villages in here are Mennonite ones in the center. And then if we move right to the center of Molochna colony, you can see underlined here Alexanderville. So that's where Shahufka ended up, got the name Alexanderville. And then to the right, bottom right of this map, you'll see a village Gnadenfeld that we'll be talking about. So it's fairly close to Alexanderville. What are the new limits on community when we arrive? When Mennonites negotiated some of the conditions of their settlement in the Russian Empire, and they got a new charter of privileges from the Tsar at the time, Paul, in 1801, but mostly they lived under a legal framework that was just like everyone else who was coming from a foreign country, starting in 1763 and continuing until the 1830s. These laws about foreign colonists required them all to settle together as one group In the case of Moluchna colony, this involved settling, as we saw, adjacent to other groups that were being brought in, German Lutherans and Catholics. Colonists were given the use of this land for free, and they could buy and sell amongst themselves, but not leave the colony, or allow non-Mennonites to settle there. Mennonites, for the first time in their history, lived just among Mennonite landowners in their villages, and in a legal framework that anticipated that this would remain the case for quite a while. The Russian government set up separate laws and a separate bureaucracy called the Guardian's Office for Foreign Colonists to deal with these immigrants, of whom among the larger group of German speakers, Mennonites were roughly 10%, while additional groups came from Bulgaria, Greece, and elsewhere. These colonists were required to set up their own local government in which only landowners could vote. Offices included village mayors, a district office, a district mayor, as well as officials appointed by the government. This local government oversaw maintaining roads, did the record keeping, provided basic functions of law and order, including the right to use corporal punishment as a penalty for minor crimes. This was a remarkable degree of self-government that was not available to any of the native Slavic populations under Tsarist rule. So Mennonites in their colonies are now faced with competing authorities between church leadership, elected political leadership, and appointed government officials, all of whom were Mennonite. It was also possible for Mennonites who suffered from moral lapses or religious indifference to be banned from a local congregation, but they could not leave the colony, as the government still classified them as Mennonites, even if the local congregation no longer did. Taken together with the ban on marrying outside the church that had been implemented already in Prussia, these new conditions helped shift Mennonite identity to being a group created by common social circumstances, instead of a group that shared common theological commitments. Because power resided with the government, Mennonites appointed by them to be local government officers came to dominate and define Mennonite life by mid-century. And Johann Cornies, you have a picture of him here, was appointed to oversee Moluchna colony and became the most important example of this phenomenon. By mid-century, a single word, model, in the Charter of Privileges had taken on a significance for Mennonites that was not there at the beginning. The Charter itself declared in its prologue, in response to a request from the Mennonites who, according to their guardians, could serve as a model to our other colonists in the area on account of their excellent work ethic and proper moral conduct. This is why they got the Charter. This prologue originally seemed to be merely a rhetorical flourish and went on to list all the rights of Mennonites. By mid-century, it was seen as a justification for Mennonites, for Mennonite wealth and for Mennonite difference, as the high legal walls around colonists started to come down. Mennonite political officials admonished Mennonites to serve as models, initially to other colonists, and then to all the other inhabitants, in order to justify their privileges and their separate social status. Mennonite officials used it as a secular stick to keep the Mennonite community in line, since religious authority had fractured. When Mennonites split into different church groups, dropped church attendance altogether, or recognized that political Mennonite leadership had more power over their everyday lives than church leadership. Mennonites as a group now acted as instructors to others, instead of working together with their neighbors on a common task, such as maintaining dikes as they had in Poland. Ordinary Mennonites heard this charge to be a model as proof of superiority over other groups, while locals, of course, resented being told to emulate Mennonites, planting the seeds of animosity that sprouted in the early 20th century under more extreme conditions. Thus, by the time Mennonites left Russia, their community had added high political, economic and social walls to the theological walls they brought with them to keep outsiders out. That their own leaders, along with some Russian officials, were telling Mennonites that they were a model to everyone else to emulate, meant that after 50 years they left with a much different self-image than when they arrived. At the same time as these new colonist laws reshaped Mennonite communal identity to be more exclusionary, a new openness to outside theological impulses and cooperation began to reshape Mennonite theological boundaries. The Mennonites' experience in Poland and Prussia with other Christians living locally in their villages was perhaps friendly, but Protestant and Catholic clergy in Poland often harassed Mennonites, called for their expulsion, or found new ways to place extraordinary taxes and fees on them. Yet also at the time Mennonites were leaving Prussia for the Russian Empire, a new type of contact with other Mennonites became possible, stirring up controversy and division among Mennonites. The most important of these new contacts were with pietists. Pietism was a 17th century response to what some saw as an overly formal and rationalistic Protestant orthodoxy. Critics of Protestant orthodoxy claimed that they focused only on getting the doctrines right and ignored the Holy Spirit and holy living. Pietist Protestants instead promoted a living, personal connection to the risen Jesus, Bible study, prayer, and a life that demonstrated Jesus' love for the lost and the poor. In one case, this new movement rejuvenated and took over an older, smaller denomination, the Moravian Brethren. In other cases, pietists remained in their state churches, but founded new organizations such as Bible and mission societies. And they invited all like-minded Christians to join them, explicitly wooing Mennonites with personal visits. These initiatives presented Mennonites with new opportunities and models to consider, meaning that in terms of lived discipleship and church life, they were the ones who needed instruction, even as in the economic sphere, they saw themselves as models to their neighbors. In Prussia, In Prussia, one key avenue for this new connection to pietism was through the community of Breckenhoswalde, which was founded northeast of Frankfurt an der Oder, a German town, in 1765. This was a daughter settlement of the Schehufka congregation, so directly connected to our story here. On this map, in the center of the map, you can see a word, the Polish name for the village of Breckenhoswalde, because it's in Poland today, and it's Błotnica. And on this map, it looks like it's a big town, but really it's a tiny village, tiny. Just looks a little bigger so you can see it. Frankfurt an der Oder is to the southwest on the edge of that map. Posen, a major Polish town, is to the southeast, to the bottom right of that map, and we're a long ways from the Vistula River Valley. So this is a community that was quite some distance from any other Mennonite settlement, and they had more interaction with locals because of that. Especially around the time of the Napoleonic Wars in the 1790s, there's some important changes here. A local man, his name was Wilhelm Lange, was Lutheran, and he sought to avoid military service and therefore joined the Mennonite congregation, which under their terms of the 1765 Charter of Privileges kept him out of the military. He soon became their village school teacher. By 1802, he was a preacher in the congregation, and by 1810, he was elected elder. His sermons emphasized the need for salvation and a personal connection with God, which are typical pietist themes that resonated well with Mennonite understandings, and some local Lutherans started to attend the Mennonite church. As one of his first acts as elder, Lange arranged for a tour for himself and one of the regional traveling ministers of the Moravian Brethren, Pastor Gottlieb Jahr, and they visited many of the Mennonite congregations in the Vistula Valley and the Delta, and they were well received. In 1884, many of those same congregations then voted to allow members to join either the London or the Berlin Bible Societies, which is the first time that Mennonites approved working with other Christians on a common goal from this area. Some congregations, like the large Heubuden congregation, gave money as a congregational project. In other cases, individuals donated on their own, a type of incipient Mennonite individualism in religious matters. About a decade later, in the 1820s, just as the Shahufka congregation was getting ready to move to the Russian Empire, an English Baptist, William Henry Angus, made the same rounds to the same Mennonite congregations, now asking for donations to Baptist missionary efforts in India. This kicked off long-standing arrangements for Mennonites to donate to a variety of mission societies, and more importantly, to start hosting large annual mission festivals that brought together Mennonites and non-Mennonites for days of prayer, worship, and reports from the mission fields. This change from being harassed by other Christians to being welcomed and even courted was a stunning reversal that lowered theological barriers to cooperation for Mennonites who had a pietist bent. The change was deeply offensive to traditionalist Mennonites. After 1812, government officials back in the Frankenholzwalder area tightened up restrictions on private meetings. They were afraid of subversive political activities if people got together on their own. And they categorized Mennonite church services as private meetings. And they argued, incorrectly, that Mennonites were not a recognized church. In other cases like this, Mennonites would have appealed to the capital in Berlin and asked them to instruct local officials to recognize Mennonites' legal status. Elder Lange, instead, arranged for Mennonite church services to be conducted under the supervision of the Moravian Brethren, bringing legal relief and regular visits from traveling Moravian Brethren preachers. At their suggestion, Mennonites for the first time introduced the practice of child dedication services. When in 1821 the Shahufka group settled in Molochna, their elder, Peter Wiedel, was instrumental in promoting the Russian Bible Society for the first time to Mennonites there, causing considerable consternation among the traditionalist church leaders, who remained skeptical of any cooperation with non-Mennonites. In 1830, the Frankenholzwalder group was faced with new restrictions from the Prussian government if they wished to maintain their military service exemption. Instead of complying, the group arranged to migrate to Molochna in 1834, and there they created the village and the congregation of Gnadenfeld, bringing important new pietist practices and connections to Molochna. In 1837, Elder Wilhelm Lange's nephew, Friedrich Lange, was baptized on his way to Gnadenfeld. He was well known in the community and elected to be a preacher there the next year, and became elder in Gnadenfeld in 1841 after Wilhelm's death. He was a close friend and a collaborator with Edvard Wust, the man who's pictured here. He was a pietist Lutheran pastor at the nearby New Hope Lutheran congregation. All of these connections brought mission interest, wider cooperation with non-Mennonites, and renewed commitments to a personal relationship with Jesus into the Molochna colony. By 1860, it also resulted in a schism that led to the establishment of the Mennonite Brethren on the one side and the churchly minded, as more traditional Mennonites were called at that time. One strand of the Mennonite Brethren leadership sought ties to Baptists, as they shared many common theological understandings. By the early 1870s, however, this new group came to understand that they would have to reassert a Mennonite identity if they wished to remain in the Russian Empire and avoid military service, something that did not interest the Baptist. Thus, over the course of several decades, a new Mennonite Brethren denomination came into being. In the realm of relations with other Christians, and in thinking about how to relate to the world as Christians, Mennonites saw, borrowed, and created significant new avenues of engagement from and with other Christians. Just as the practices of living into new social boundaries altered and strengthened a communal Mennonite identity, so too did the struggle to renew spiritual life within the community and efforts to mobilize the Mennonite community for joint work in missions and Bible society out in the world. Over their 50 years in the Russian Empire, Mennonites acquired a new and deep interest in education. They created their own education system, complete with staffing, resourcing, and training. And the roots of this system go back to developments along the Vistula River as well. Mennonites in Poland, for the most part, thought about education the way they thought about taking care of dikes. This is something best done together with your neighbors. There are a few sporadic mentions of exclusive Mennonite schools in the early period, but mostly Mennonites went to one-room village schoolhouses with local non-Mennonite kids. Some education was important. Literacy would have been much more common for these people than for most of the Polish peasant population, but the idea of a specifically Christian education came to Mennonites from pietist influence. Twice. Thank you. In 1826, members of the Danzig and the Heubuden congregation in the Vistula Delta started their own school across the river from the town of Marienburg in the tiny little hamlet of Rodlauferhuben. And so, again, you can see the Rodlauferhuben's on the map, and it looks like it's a substantial place. It's tiny. It's kind of like Zimmerdale. There's a little red, and then there's a river, and then there's a little red star. That little red star marks the castle of the Teutonic Knights that's still there. So Mennonite education starts in Zimmerdale, but with a massive, massive castle in view. It's a really unusual story. The first teacher here was Friedrich Lange, the nephew of Wilhelm Lange, who later became the founding elder in Gnadenfeld. Friedrich Lange had been teaching in a nearby village, Montau, and then he was in a city school in Graudensk, and then he was invited to start this school just for Mennonites. Yet at this time, he was still a member of the Lutheran Church. Common pietist commitments made this kind of ecumenical engagement possible in a school setting, even though it would not have been possible in a church setting. Thus, schools provided a new way for some Mennonites to reimagine the scope of their community. Friedrich Lange, at the same time, became a co-founder of the Danzig Mission Society, a Protestant effort, and he was an active promoter. His school became the first location for Mennonite mission festivals. Lutheran clergy from Marienburg across the river got this school shut down. They didn't want it in their area in 1836, and then it moved a little further north to another little village, Broskerfelde. And the mission festivals followed it, and they continued for decades, bringing Mennonites and non-Mennonites together. The community in Brenkenhofswalde was influenced by the Moravian Brethren pastors there to create their own school, also in the 1820s, with a specific focus on educating children in a school setting for a Christian life. This was seen as an important follow-up to the idea behind child dedication, and it added a new component to Christian formation beyond the family and the congregation. A local Mennonite farmer, Peter Jantzen, began a school out of a room in his house. And in 1831, the local school inspector closed the school down because Jantzen did not have a teacher's certification. After that, Mennonite students who wanted more than just a basic education went to the Mennonite school, first in Rodlauferhuben and then in Broskersfelde. Another Brenkenhofswalde teacher in this time was Tobias Foth. He began teaching in various area schools in 1807, and he managed to pass, eventually, a teacher certification test, and he got a better paying job in a city school in Graudensk. In 1820, Johann Cornies called Voth to come to Molochna to teach at a newly opened, more advanced school called the Orlauf Central School. And it's called the Orlauf Central School because it's in the village of Orlauf in Molochna, which is in the southwest corner of the colony. Voth only stayed here for 6 years because he had conflicts with Cornies, who didn't, and he introduced both a love of higher education to his students in those years, but he brought all this other ideas with him, stressing missions, organizing mission festivals in the schools, a warmer piety, a new style of singing music. All this came to Molochna. The school burned down in 1848, and it was inactive until the 1860s, so the action moved elsewhere. A new central school in Kortica colony rose to prominence and also featured a connection to the wider Przechówka community. Heinrich Franz was born in 1812 near Schönsee, which is just across the river from Przechówka, and he was a member of one of the congregations in that village. He was an early student of Friedrich Lange at Rodloferhuben, and then he went to Brenkenhoswalde and taught there in that school until the migration in Gnadenfeld, and then he taught in a village school there. From 1846 until 1858, he was the main teacher at Kortica Secondary School. He had teacher certifications both from Prussia and from Russia. He wrote his own math curriculum for teaching arithmetic that was widely emulated in Mennonite village schools. He also introduced the system of using numbers instead of notes for musical notation, which made it easier to copy out music, and promoted 4-part singing. What you're looking at here is Holy God, we praise thy name. Could you sing it from that? This version, this is a scan from a 1994 hymnal that's in use today in the Frankenthal Mennonite Brethren Church in Germany. So some groups are still using this musical notation. It goes all the way back to Heinrich Franz. What is the impact of building a Mennonite education system from the ground up that encompasses not only numerous village schools, but also a higher education system to train teachers and to provide at least some of the system's curriculum? All of this focus on education produced a highly literate peasant population involved in its own administration. One historian has called Molochna the most literate region of any periphery area in the entire Russian Empire, with the densest collection of historical records. This is so unusual. And historians are very excited about it because we have good records. Beyond that, education plays an important role in reshaping how a community sees itself. An oral community might not reflect as much on change over time. A more traditional religious community might see itself as living in God's time, in God's kingdom, and not account as much for influences or innovations that might come from the outside. A community that builds its own education system that can obtain state certification has created the institutions and the proclivity to record and to try to steer its own history. Some of these early prominent school teachers were also the first Mennonite historians. A community with a recorded history measures itself differently against the past or the present than a community that sees itself as always directly linked to God and not really part of the worldly environment. Historians have also noted how in this first half of the 19th century generally, the rise of literacy, newspapers, and the connections thereby engendered created larger communities of belonging among people who spoke the same language, read the same newspapers. Thus, this period is the foundational era for the rise of nationalism. Perhaps some of these same development among Mennonites contributed to a new communal identity that went beyond the local congregation to include all Mennonites, despite the differences in history and theological orientations. In any case, a community with experience of and commitment to education is ready to hit the ground running when they show up in a new country and want to recreate their own educational system almost as soon as they get here. And in this Mennonite educational history, the Przechówka congregation, especially via its Gnadenfeld affiliate, had a role to play in events that led to the creation of both Bethel and Tabor colleges. Now, if you ask Google you'll find out that Bethel is 13.1 miles from here, and Tabor is 13.3. I have no idea what that means. Given that Bethel's first president, C.H. Wadle, is from this congregation, perhaps it's fitting that Alexanderville is ever so slightly closer to Bethel. In any case, I think these dual educational institutions are certainly one of the most surprising legacies of the sojourn in Ukraine. Now we got to talk about money. Mennonites in Poland and Prussia would have enjoyed a higher standard of living than most of the population, who were serfs of the nobility and therefore could not own land. But Mennonites were not that much different than their immediate neighbors, who were also landowners. Economic equality with the neighbors changed when Mennonites got to the Russian Empire, and the distance to peasants who were serfs there increased. Most Mennonites arriving in the Russian Empire were given free control over 160 acres of land. They could pass it on to a single heir, sell it to another person in the colony, rent it out, but they did not hold the deed to it in the way that we think of holding a deed until after reforms in the 1870s. Other Mennonites received an 80, or for the few who pursued a trade or arrived too late, they only got like a 3-acre homestead. In addition, Mennonites collectively were given interest-free loans to help cover transportation and startup costs, and an initial length of time without paying taxes. These options were only available to colonists, not to locals. Mennonites who came from the wet lowlands in Poland had depended on intensive livestock operations, typically dairy cows, for their livelihood. Perhaps almost a third came as craftsmen. Neither option would work in the steppes of Ukraine, as the climate was much drier and there were no towns to provide a market for anything craftsmen could produce. Environmental constraints forced Mennonites to alter their way of life, and a rapid rate of population growth, both from high birth rates and continued migration, put real pressure on their ability to provide a livelihood for everyone. After the initial years of getting established and then the early disruptions of the Napoleonic Wars, after 1815, Mennonites made their first shift from subsistence farming to market-based livestock production. For the next couple of decades, grazing merino sheep and selling the wool was the major cash crop. The idea came from the Russian Guardianship Committee and was promoted and implemented by Johann Cornice's administration over Mennonite affairs. Given the existing climate and steppe grass, keeping one merino sheep required about an acre of land. But merino wool would bring 7 to 10 times more on the market than native wool, although they were harder to care for. As is often the case in life, this innovative resolution of one problem resulted in the creating of a different problem. One issue that was that imperial law did not allow for the division of farms, so that only one child could inherit a farm, and the other children had to go someplace else. Even though the Mennonite administration saw to it that widows and siblings were paid their fair share, there was still a need for new farms. Yet given the economics around sheep grazing, there was a lot of pressure to find and control additional grazing land. Molochna colony had some reserves that were held on government orders for new settlers. In the meantime, the current landowners, who were the only ones who could vote in colony elections, wrote themselves favorable grazing leases on this land and blocked access to it by the landless among them. Mennonites were thus successful in increasing both wool production and the percentage of their population who could not buy land. In 1839, in other German colonies, the landless were mostly young families waiting for their turn on a family farm, 16% of the households. In Molochna, the landless rate was 47%. So starting in 1836, Mennonite economic activity turned to grain production. And the most important factor here was the introduction of black fallow 4-year system of crop rotation, which left a quarter of the ground fallow every year with explicit instructions from Johann Cornies to not have any cover crops. It's got to be black. Cover crops deplete soil moisture. And moisture was a major concern because there had been a devastating drought in 1833. Leaving the fallow fields black for 1 year instead of waiting for cover grass to sprout and then grazing it for several years, as had been the practice, doubled the yield per acre by 1848. On top of that, Molochna Mennonites also doubled the acreage under cultivation in that same time span. This practice, as it spread elsewhere, eventually helped turn Ukraine into a major grain production region, first in the Russian Empire and then on a global scale. A second innovation in 1836 was the government's establishment of a new port at Berdansk, which was 40 miles east of Molochna. This made access to market much easier, which was vital for shipping grain, which is heavier and harder to transport than wool. Now Mennonite farmers had ready access to broad markets. This transition to grain was sped along by the competition from cheaper wool now entering the global market from Australia. Grain production at scale was not possible in most parts of the world, giving Mennonites in Ukraine an important advantage. The growing gap between land-owning and landless Mennonites fed conflict from the 1840s on. One effort to address this problem, proposed in 1836 and implemented in 1841, was the founding of New Hauptstadt in Molochna Colony as a location to centralize craft production. This was a crucial first step away from relying exclusively on agriculture for Mennonite livelihoods. There was already in Hauptstadt, or in that area, a concentration of breweries, vinegar manufacturers, and a cloth factory. And so you can see Neu-Hauptstadt is on the edge of Hauptstadt, kind of an administrative center for Molochna Colony. And across the river, the village of Priship was a craft production center for Lutheran and Catholic German colonists. So Mennonites kind of cribbed that idea from Priship and instituted it at Neu-Hauptstadt. In 1846, the government lifted restrictions that limited Mennonites' trade and movements to their own districts, so that now these enterprises could branch out and sell regionally. This eventually created a new class of wealthy Mennonite industrialists, and it provided basic employment for many landless. By the 1870s, when some Mennonites started to leave the Russian Empire for North America, Mennonite flour mills were producing a third of all the flour consumed in the 3 southern imperial provinces, and roughly that percentage of all the agricultural machinery for the area as well. Mennonites as a community had certainly grown much wealthier in their time in the Russian Empire, being at the leading edge of improvements in agriculture and industry at the very beginning of the industrial age for Russia. While many individual Mennonites did not share in this prosperity, as a society they were now well integrated into the local, regional, and even the imperial economy, having faced major transformations in the last 50 years and emerging as much different economic actors when they left the Russian Empire than they had been when they arrived. The recasting of Mennonite self-image in the Russian Empire might be one way to explain the prominence of this short time in our historical memory. The outside pressure applied by imperial law to foreign colonists to live separately, reinforced externally for 50 years the internal theological preference to only marry and socialize with other Mennonites. This community was now a social construct overlaid on the theological foundation. Engaging in new churchly tasks outside of our own boundaries, like mission and Bible societies, provided a new sense of Christian purpose, now with an external focus. Education was also given a religious meaning for the first time, as it joined family and congregation as an important location of Christian formation. At the same time, education enabled Mennonites to conceive of themselves in a new collective way, giving meaning and direction as a new path to the kingdom of God for a community on the move. Being at the forefront of the explosion of wealth that accompanied the Industrial Revolution provided Mennonites with the wherewithal and the habits of mind to build new institutions that would preserve Mennonite unity as we worked at the common task of equipping the next generation to take this new sense of a Mennonite community out into the world. From this perspective, nothing made more sense than to build a new school on the prairie. There's Bethel College in the early years. No trees in sight. It's all prairie. This made so much sense. We started this project just a dozen years or so after arriving in a new homeland. The community arrived with a new self-awareness. It knew what it wanted to do, and it remembers with fondness the time and the place where it came to think of itself as a community in the world, not just as a community passing through on its way to heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jantzen. We will take questions if you have any. I have a mic that I'll bring around so that everybody can hear your question. So feel free to raise your hand. And of course, Brian's going to start.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about how a community thinks about themselves. And while you're talking, a thought struck me, how, you described the communities in Malachin as the government situation. Mm-hmm. But was there ever any kind of a church conference, like we could call Western District Conference now? I know in Prussia they talk about the Flemish and Frisian groups, but was there ever an association of churches that did things or met or held conferences?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a kind of a complicated answer. So churches were always doing things in this time period, but especially in this early part, when the church leadership disagreed with Johann Cornys or government-backed officials, the churches lost. So Cornys was able to remove church leadership. But they're all Mennonites and they all have to live together. But the governments, so you could kind of imagine, I don't know who the pastor is here now, but imagine Laura Kelly says, well, it's nice you have a pastor, but they have to go. Well, Laura Kelly we could appoint Brian. What if Laura Kelly appointed Brian in charge of Alexanderville and he says the pastor has to go? So the churches are doing things really after this time period. And so this is a part we wouldn't talk about. Churches got more organized and more active and as government oversight went away. So once the government oversight went away, the churches came back and could organize and actually do things. But this period, church leadership was pushed aside by Imperial Russian control, which, had this tremendous impact.
Questions? Anyone else?
Yeah, Mark, why Tabor and Bethel, since you brought that up? And how much intermingling was there between the MBs, the mainline Mennonites, and then the KMBs? I assume they came on the same ships, but otherwise did they stay away from each other?
Well, I don't know a lot specifically about MB-KMB relations other than that after they spent enough time in proximity, they figured out how to get together. But yeah, this was early on. This is, I think, part of this reimagining the community. So everybody knows that MBs are over there and the churchly minded are over here, and the Kleine Gemeinde is something else, and the KMBs are something else, and each one thinks the other one does it all wrong. But we all know we're in the same family. How does that happen? Why do we think we're in the same family when they do it wrong? But we're still the same family. So I think it's this sense of we're all a family, even though we know, I mean, everybody's got one of those in the family, right, that does things wrong. But we're a family. Why should we think that? And I think this experience in the Russian Empire created this sort of a sense of a Mennonite community that has these internal squabbles.
Just to follow up then, so for the KMEs who moved to the Crimea, obviously wanted to be physically separated. But they had no choice but to board the same ships when it was time to come west.
Well, my understanding is that the Crimean Mennonite Brethren Church was like its own start, like they got started and came to the same conclusions as other Mennonite brethren. So they weren't that, I mean, they wanted to be separate, but they weren't that separate. And yeah, you're not, well, if you're just getting on the ship, they're on the ship probably with Ukrainians and Catholics, and you don't care who's on your ship. But it's so interesting, why did they settle so close to each other if they didn't like each other? So, you still talk to your brother or whoever in your family that you don't get along with. You'll still get together once in a while. You still know their family. So who can explain how families fight and how they do that is really interesting. But to me, what's interesting is that they came to see themselves as family. But there'd be more to explore there. I don't know those details.
Not so much of a question as a follow-up for you. Once they were here, they were separate, but they all came together here in Gossel to establish the Bethesda Mennonite Hospital, which is the first hospital in Kansas, or in North America, the first Mennonite hospital. It was started by Alexanderville, the Mennonite Brethren, and the KMBs. All of them were here, and they worked together to do that.
I'm interested in the landlessness problem, and I was reading a bit about, I don't know if I can pronounce it correctly, the Nogai, some of the neighboring groups that were living in that same area from whom Mennonites rented ground. Do you have more that you can tell me about that?
So the Nogai were this sort of nomadic or pastoralist group. Is that who you're thinking of? Yeah. So they're Muslim. They're descendants way back of the Mongol who had ruled this part of the world, hundreds of years earlier. And they're just descendants of that. And they're kind of pastoralist, nomadic. And they had also been living someplace else, not that far away, but someplace else. So they arrive in the area about the same time as all these other foreign colonists, including Mennonites. And the government, of course, the Russian government's telling everybody what to do. So they're telling the Nogai, you have to start farming and quit just, chasing livestock around, having your own sheep or whatever. You've got to settle. And Johann Cornys actually got involved with helping them. And so he had some administrative oversight over them, which is how he probably also got Mennonites to get grazing contracts with them, because they're like, well, we got more land, we'll take the money, you do the grazing. And by the time that was all settled, those contracts might have been more to the Mennonites' advantage than to the Nogai. But they also were not, their biggest beef was not with the Mennonites, but with the Russian government, because they were Muslims and they didn't like being told how to live and how to settle. So they pretty much leave and go to the Ottoman Empire, or at least many of them do. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's some really interesting connections with more indigenous people. They aren't entirely indigenous because they also moved in about this time, but they're being forced to move by the Russian government. And they would be probably the ones with the longest claim to the land. And they're eventually, pushed aside. So that's a story that also sounds, has some resonance to what happens in Kansas.
Question over here.
About what percentage of Mennonites immigrated from Prussia to Russia versus the ones that stayed in Prussia?
That's a great question. So going from Prussia to Russia, it's always probably single digits or very low double digits. But in Prussia, after 1789, Mennonites cannot buy any additional real estate, basically ever. So if you have a farm, you can pass it off to one son. Everybody else has to immigrate. So Mennonites are immigrating. There's a trickle all the time to the Russian Empire. So that by the how long does it take? Immigration starts from Prussia in 1879. Probably about the time Shahufka moves, the populations might be equal, just because all the growth is in Russia. The Mennonite population in Prussia stays around 10 to 12,000 for 150 years. That's not normal or natural. But the population in Russia by the 1870s is 3 times that. So all the growth is in the Russian Empire. And then from the Russian Empire, when they leave in 1874, I don't know if that's roughly a third, I'm not sure, a third or less, a quarter or a third leave. But the majority stay in Russia. Does that answer your question?
Anyone else with a question?
Just wait, she's going to bring the mic and then everyone can hear. Oh,
What?
no, there's somebody behind you.
What happened in 1874 that they all started to pop and leave?
Why they immigrated? Yeah. Well, I always ask my kids, do you want the long answer or the short answer? But I think you want the short answer. So the short answer is in 1870, the Russian government announced that military service was coming. And Mennonites then tried to figure out, can we get that reversed? Can we get some modifications, or is it time to leave? And so they started leaving to keep away from the military. The other thing that was announced at the same time was, and this beautiful education system you built is now going to switch to teaching in Russian. So all the Mennonite kids will be instructed in Russian by Russian-speaking teachers, which initially would have to be non-Mennonites because they don't have any. So if you want to stay out of the military and you don't want to learn Russian, it's time to leave. Eventually, Mennonites negotiate a forestry service that lets them, basically, it's the same thing as civilian public service. They can do work under civilian supervision, but they have to learn Russian. So most of them stay, and they do alternative service. But those who didn't like that deal came here. Does that?
We got the question in this area. Yeah.
There was one, but I think it was the same. So, yeah. Okay.
Anyone else with questions? Well, thank you, Dr. Jantzen. Chris will close us out here.
Yes, thank you, Mark. That was a very interesting and very informative talk. I just want to, before we close out, remind people about the Heritage Dinner that will be April 5. And as said before, you can get tickets or sign up, I believe, in that South Lobby. I also want to thank Delton and Steve up there in the sound box for doing the live and the Zoom. We really appreciate that very much. So I think that concludes our afternoon. It was great to see so many people out here. And I think that's all we have today.